had the greatest voices R&B ever produced. But behind the music, something dark was destroying them. The industry watched and said nothing.
And we shared this apartment together, just us.
Here's what most people still don't know. Some of their biggest hits were recorded while they were completely falling apart. This is the story nobody wanted to tell. Number 1 will shock you. Number 10, Ron Isley, Between the Sheets.
Hey girl, ain't no mistake.
Close your eyes for a second. You're sitting in a dimly lit room, it's late, the kind of night where the whole city feels quiet. And that voice, that deep, silk-wrapped voice comes out of the speakers like it was made just for you. That's Ron Isley. That was always Ron Isley, whether he was leading the Isley Brothers through 40 years of hit records or stepping up as the legendary Mr. Biggs in the 2000s. Ron made you feel like you were the only person in the room, but behind all that smooth charisma, there was a man quietly unraveling. Ron Isley was the frontman and the spiritual backbone of the Isley Brothers. The group started in the late 1950s and became one of the longest-running acts in all of American music.
Help me sing.
And they gave you Shout, they gave you It's Your Thing, they gave you Voyage to Atlantis, and then in 2003, Ron stepped into the Mr. Biggs character, this wise, slick, older lover persona on records with R. Kelly. Those records went platinum. Down Low was everywhere. Radio stations couldn't stop playing it. The man was in the middle of a full comeback, but underneath the comeback, Ron was battling prescription drug dependency. It was quiet. It was private. It wasn't crack cocaine on the evening news. It was the kind of addiction that sneaks up on people who work too hard, who feel too much pain, and who have too many people depending on them to ever slow down.
Oh, baby, baby.
And then the IRS came knocking. Ron owed millions in back taxes. In 2006, he was convicted of tax evasion and sentenced to 3 years in federal prison. He was in his mid-60s. One of R&B's greatest living voices behind bars. Here's something most people don't know. Between the Sheets from 1983 was so smooth, so perfectly crafted, that Biggie Smalls used the sample as the backbone for Big Papa 12 years later. That one song crossed 2 generations of black music in America, and Ron Isley didn't even know how deep that influence ran until he heard it on the radio.
You know, I'll make you feel alright.
Ron's addiction story gets buried because it doesn't fit the dramatic narrative people expect. There were no public meltdowns, no paparazzi photos, no viral moments.
Just cling to me. Let your mind be.
His fall was slow and silent and dignified in the worst possible way because nobody talked about it until it was already over.
Free. While making love between.
The music industry prefers its tragedies loud. Ron's was quiet, and that made it easier to ignore. He came out of prison, rebuilt his voice, and kept going. That alone deserves more respect than most people give him.
The sheets. Ooh, girl.
Keep watching because as we go deeper into this list, the stories get heavier. A lot heavier. Number 9, Teddy Pendergrass. Turn Off the Lights.
Turn off the light.
If you were a grown woman in the late 1970s, Teddy Pendergrass wasn't just a singer. He was an experience. The man sold out concerts that were women only, women only.
And light a candle.
Think about what that means. He was so powerful, so sensual, so raw that promoters had to organize shows just for female audiences because the energy in the room got too intense.
Tonight I'm in a romantic mood.
There has never been another man in R&B who did that. Not before, not since, but behind that raw masculine energy, Teddy was living fast, way too fast.
Ooh, yeah. Let's take a shot.
Teddy came up through Harold Melvin and the Blue Notes in Philadelphia. When he went solo in 1977, he exploded. His first 5 solo albums all went platinum.
Shower together.
Turn Off the Lights dropped in 1979 and became one of the most seductive R&B records ever recorded. It's at hit number 2 on the Billboard R&B charts and was the kind of song that radio stations played at midnight on purpose.
Yes, I'll wash your body if you.
Teddy was fully embedded in the Philadelphia cocaine scene of the late 70s. The Philly soul world, as beautiful as it sounded, ran on cocaine and late nights and access to everything money could buy.
You wash my yes.
Teddy had the money. Teddy had the access. And Teddy was human enough to fall into it.
Rub me down in some hot oils, baby.
Then March 18th, 1982 happened. Teddy crashed his Rolls Royce in Philadelphia. He was paralyzed from the chest down. He was 31 years old.
Baby, yeah. And I'll do.
The circumstances surrounding that crash were murky. There were questions about what had been consumed that night that were never fully answered publicly. What is undeniable is that the accident ended one of the greatest physical presences in the history of soul music.
Same thing to you. Just turn off.
Teddy performed at a charity concert called A Gift of Music in 1982, just before the crash, and the crowd response was so overwhelming that security had to physically separate fans from the stage. That was his last full performance before the accident. The last time the world saw him standing.
Come to me.
What gets lost in Teddy's story is that he rebuilt himself beautifully. He released music from a wheelchair. He got married, had children, advocated for people with spinal injuries, but because his comeback didn't sound like the Teddy of 1979, the industry moved on. His addiction chapter gets compressed into the crash, and the crash gets overshadowed by the comeback. The full truth, the cocaine years, the lifestyle, the way that world contributed to what happened rarely gets told with honesty.
Girl, I want to give you a special treat. You've been so sweet.
Stay with me, we're just getting started. And the names coming up are gonna hit you right in the chest.
If this song just hit you in that quiet place, don't let this moment be a one-time thing. Subscribe to Demo. We're building a home for real R&B and soul, the kind that heals, the kind that tells the truth. Hit subscribe and come back whenever you need a song that understands you.
Every story you see here takes hours of digging, piecing together history and bringing forgotten moments back to life. If you'd like to support that work, you can become a channel member. It's just the cost of a cup of coffee, but it helps us keep these stories alive, and for that, we're grateful. Number 8, Luther Vandross, Never Too Much. Luther Vandross was not just a singer, he was architecture. When Luther built a vocal performance, every single brick was placed with intention. The breath, the pause, the run, the stillness. Nobody in R&B history made Falling in Love sound as beautiful and as inevitable as Luther did. When Never Too Much came on, you didn't just hear it. You felt it rearrange something inside you. But what Luther was carrying inside him, the real weight almost nobody saw. Luther released Never Too Much in 1981 as his debut single on Epic Records. It went straight to #1 on the R&B charts. The record was produced by Luther himself along with Marcus Miller, one of the greatest bassist producers in music history. The sound was pristine, adult contemporary with a deep soul foundation. When it became the blueprint for what smooth R&B would sound like for the next 15 years. But Luther's life offstage was a constant internal battle. He struggled with his weight his entire career, gaining and losing hundreds of pounds across decades. And tied into that struggle was a dependency on prescription medications, emotional eating, and cycles of depression that he rarely discussed publicly. He was a deeply private man who performed publicly with enormous joy and hid enormous pain. In April 2003, Luther suffered a massive stroke. He was 51 years old. He spent the last 2 years of his life largely unable to communicate with the voice that had meant so much to so many people. He passed away in July 2005. Before Luther was a solo star, he was one of the most in-demand backing vocalists in New York City. He sang on commercials, on jingles, on sessions for David Bowie, Donna Summer, Bette Midler, and Diana Ross. The man who became R&B royalty spent years singing in the background. There's a lesson in there somewhere. The R&B world talks about Luther's genius constantly, and rightfully so, but the conversation about what his addiction and health struggles truly cost him rarely goes deep. His personal life was shrouded in secrecy. The industry protected that secrecy because Luther was worth too much commercially for the full truth to come out. His tragedy is treated as a medical story when it was also a human story about a man who numbed his pain in private for decades. #7 is where this list takes its first real turn toward darkness. Get ready. It's what? #7, Marvin Gaye. What's going on?
Mother, mother.
There are maybe 5 albums in the history of recorded music that changed the conversation about what music could actually say. What's Going On is one of them. Marvin Gaye looked at Vietnam, looked at poverty, looked at what America was doing to black people, and he turned all of it into something so beautiful that people couldn't help but listen. That took immense courage and immense pain. Marvin spent the rest of his life trying to outrun both of them.
There's too many of you crying.
What's Going On was released in 1971 on Motown Records. Berry Gordy didn't want to release it. He thought it was too political, too risky, too different. Marvin had to fight for it. When it finally dropped, it became the best-selling Motown single in the label's history at that point. When the album that followed it is considered one of the greatest ever made by anyone in any genre.
Brother, brother, brother.
But by the time Marvin got to the mid-1970s, cocaine had become a constant companion. By the Let's Get It On era, he was using heavily. By the Hear My Dear album in 1978, that devastating record about his divorce from Anna Gordy, he was freebasing. The album was his public breakdown put to music, and instead of getting help, he fled.
There's far too many of you dying.
He moved to Europe, first London, then Ostend, Belgium, then the south of France. He was running from the IRS, from his debts, from his failed marriage, and from himself. In Belgium, without the social connections that enabled his habit, he actually got cleaner for a period. He wrote Sexual Healing there. It won him 2 Grammy Awards in 1983, his first Grammys ever.
You know we've got to find a way.
He came home, and the demons came back with him. On April 1st, 1984, one day before his 45th birthday, his father shot him. He was gone. Marvin recorded Sexual Healing in a rented studio in Ostend using a borrowed synthesizer. The song that brought him his greatest critical validation was recorded on borrowed equipment in a foreign country by a man who was essentially in exile. That's the most Marvin Gaye fact that exists.
To bring some loving here today.
People talk about Marvin's death as a tragedy involving his father, and it absolutely was. But the cocaine, the years of freebasing, the paranoia it created, the way it warped his relationship with everyone around him, including his family, that context gets softened. The drug use didn't pull the trigger, but it created the atmosphere that made the ending almost inevitable.
Father, Father.
We are now entering the top 6, and from here, every single story is one that will stay with you long after this video ends. Number 6, Bobby Brown, My Prerogative. In 1988, Bobby Brown was the definition of cool. He came out of New Edition, one of the greatest boy groups of all time, and he stepped into something harder, something more street, something that felt like the future of R&B. My Prerogative wasn't just a song. It was a declaration. I do what I want. Nobody can tell me anything. For a 20-year-old black kid from Roxbury, Boston, that energy was everything. But living by that declaration, doing exactly what you want with no guardrails, will eventually destroy you. My Prerogative was produced by Teddy Riley and released in 1988 on MCA Records. It hit #1 on the Billboard Hot 100. The Don't Be Cruel album, it came from sold over 12 million copies. Bobby was 20 years old and the biggest name in New Jack Swing. And then came the drugs, crack cocaine, PCP, alcohol. Bobby has spoken honestly about this in interviews over the years. He said that the lifestyle of fame at that age, the money, the access, the people around him who were using made it almost impossible not to get pulled in. He got pulled in deep. His marriage to Whitney Houston in 1992 became a public soap opera, fueled in part by their mutual struggles with substances, the reality show, the mug shots, the concerts where he looked like a shell of himself. Bobby became the punchline for a generation, the easy answer when people wanted to explain what happened to Whitney, but here's what's real: Bobby survived. He buried his son, Bobby Christina, in 2015. He buried Whitney in 2012. He buried people who were supposed to outlive him, and he is still standing. That is not nothing. That is everything. You know, Bobby was only 15 years old when he was kicked out of New Edition. 15! The group's management decided he was too wild, too unpredictable, and too much to handle. They replaced him, and the anger and hurt of that rejection at 15 fueled everything that came after, both the greatness and the destruction. History scapegoated Bobby for Whitney's decline in a way that wasn't fully fair. Whitney had her own agency. Whitney made her own choices, and the music industry that profited from both of them did absolutely nothing to intervene for either of them. Bobby has said himself that the blame placed on him was easier for people to accept than the truth, which is that the whole system failed both of them. Some ask me questions, why am I so Number 5 is the one this whole video has been building toward, and when you hear the full story, not the headlines, the full story, it will break your heart all over again. Number 5, at Whitney Houston, I Will Always Love You.
If I should.
When Whitney Houston opened her mouth, the world stopped. That is not an exaggeration. That is a documented fact. There are people who heard her for the first time and literally cried because they couldn't process how a human being could produce that sound. She wasn't just a great singer, she was the standard by which every other singer would be measured for the rest of time.
Stay. I will.
And the world watched that standard get dismantled, slowly, publicly, painfully. I Will Always Love You was originally written and recorded by Dolly Parton in 1973. Whitney's version, and produced by David Foster for the 1992 film The Bodyguard on Arista Records, became the best-selling single by a woman in music history at the time. It spent 14 weeks at #1 on the Billboard Hot 100.
But only be in your way.
It won a Grammy for Record of the Year. It redefined what a power ballad could be, but by the mid-1990s, Whitney was deep in a crack cocaine addiction. She has spoken about it herself. Bobby Brown has spoken about it. People close to her have confirmed it. The voice that cost nothing in 1985 began to show cracks by 1999. By 2009, when she released I Look to You, the voice was a shadow, still beautiful in flashes, but fundamentally changed. The instrument had been compromised. Her appearance on the Diane Sawyer interview in 2002 is one of the most heartbreaking moments in music television history.
I'll go, but I know.
She was thin, unsteady, defensive, and she said something that has stayed with people ever since. She said crack is cheap. She said she made too much money to smoke crack. People laughed. But behind that deflection was a woman who was deeply ashamed and deeply sick.
I'll think of you every
Now, earlier in this video, I promised you something. I told you there was a story behind the story. And here it is. There are people who have said, and this is their version, not a stated fact, that Whitney's addiction accelerated significantly during the filming of The Bodyguard.
step of the way.
Some people who were on set have described an environment that was chaotic and emotionally destabilizing for her. Her relationship with Kevin Costner was complicated. The pressure on her from Arista, from Clive Davis, from everyone who needed that film and that soundtrack to succeed was immense. In interviews, it's been said that Whitney felt simultaneously like the most powerful and the most powerless person in the room during that entire period. She was the product, while she was the asset, and nobody around her had the authority or the courage to say, this person needs help before anything
And
else. Some people say Clive Davis knew. Some people say Arista's financial interest in her career delayed any real intervention by years. There are different versions of that story. What is not disputed is this: the system that built Whitney Houston did not protect her. And by the time anyone tried, it was too late.
will always.
She was found in a bathtub at the Beverly Hilton Hotel on February 11th, 2012. She was 48 years old. The autopsy confirmed cocaine use and accidental drowning. The voice that stopped the world gone.
Love you.
The narrative around Whitney became so focused on the addiction and the marriage that her actual artistry, the musicological significance of what she did, gets flattened into a tragedy. You know, she was also a record producer. She was an actress. She was a businesswoman. She was a mother. The whole woman rarely gets honored the way the whole woman deserved.
Will always love you.
Number 4 is a man who didn't just have a drug problem. He made the drug problem his brand, and it still wasn't enough warning for anyone around him. Number 4, Rick James, super freak.
She's a very kinky.
Rick James walked into every room like he owned the building and the block it was sitting on. The Jerry curl, the sequined outfits, the bass that felt like it was coming up through the floor. Rick was funk royalty. He was soul with an edge. He was the kind of performer who made you feel like standing still was a waste of your time on this earth. But Rick James wasn't performing a character. He was living one, and that character needed cocaine to survive.
Girl, the kind you don't take home to mother.
Super Freak was released in 1981 on Gordy Records, a Motown imprint, and it was produced by Rick James himself. It hit number 3 on the Billboard Hot 100 and number 1 on the R&B charts. It became one of the most recognizable funk records ever made. And then MC Hammer sampled the bass line for You Can't Touch This in 1990 and introduced it to an entirely new generation.
She will never let your spirits down. Once it
Rick freebased cocaine openly. He talked about it in interviews. He put the lifestyle into his music. He surrounded himself with people who enabled it because he was paying for everything. By the mid-1980s, his creative output had slowed dramatically. By the early 1990s, he was facing criminal charges for assault charges that resulted in a prison sentence.
get her off the streets. Oh, girl. She likes the boys in the band.
He served time, he came out, he tried to rebuild, and then Dave Chappelle's famous impersonation, I'm Rick James, bitch, on Chappelle's show. In 2003, gave him a strange second life as a pop culture punchline. Rick appeared on the show himself. He seemed to be in on the joke, but people who were close to him say the joke hurt more than he let on.
And she says that I'm her all-time favorite.
On August 6th, 2004, Rick James was found dead in his home in Los Angeles. He was 56 years old. The coroner found 9 different substances in his system, including cocaine, methamphetamine, and multiple prescription drugs. 9. The man who sang about the super freak life lived it, and it consumed him completely.
When I make my move to her room, it's the right time. She's never hiding.
Before Rick James was Rick James, he dodged the Vietnam draft by fleeing to Canada and forming a band with Neil Young. Yes, that Neil Young. The two of them played in a group called the Mina Birds in Toronto. In the mid-1960s, the band was signed to Motown but never released any music. Rick was arrested and returned to the U.S. shortly after. Neil Young's career went one way. Rick James's went another. History is a strange thing.
Please. Oh, no. That girl is pretty wild, no.
The Chappelle's Show moment gave Rick cultural immortality, but it also cemented the caricature. He's the real Rick James, the songwriter, the producer who worked with Smokey Robinson and Tina Marie and Eddie Murphy. The man who mentored dozens of younger artists gets buried under the super freak and the cocaine jokes. He was far more complex than the punchline the internet turned him into.
The kind of girl you read about.
Number 3 is the entry on this list that makes music historians genuinely angry, because this is a voice that deserved the world, and the world let her down completely. Number 3, Phyllis Hyman, Living All Alone. If you know Phyllis Hyman, you already feel something shift inside you when you hear her name, and if you don't know her, then what you're about to hear is going to change how you understand what R&B actually lost in the 1980s and 1990s. Phyllis Hyman was 6 feet tall. She walked into rooms like a storm front. And when she opened her mouth, she sang with a depth and an honesty that made other singers seem like they were just going through the motions. She deserved everything. She got far too little, and the industry she gave everything to did not give enough back. Living All Alone was released in 1986 on Philadelphia International Records. It was one of the defining records of the late classic soul era, produced with the full sophistication that label was known for. And the album of the same name explored loneliness, romantic disappointment, and the quiet devastation of being seen but not truly known. Phyllis didn't just sing those themes, she was living them. She battled alcohol dependency and prescription drug abuse for most of her adult life. The entertainment industry, she existed in the jazz clubs, the Broadway stages, the soul circuit, was built on late nights, on access to substances, on a culture that celebrated excess and said nothing when that excess started eating people alive. Phyllis was also deeply, clinically depressed. She spoke about it in interviews with a rawness that made people uncomfortable. She talked about feeling used by the industry. She talked about record labels that didn't know how to market a black woman who was intelligent and complex and refused to simplify herself for commercial consumption.
Welcome back into my life.
She talked about romantic relationships that broke her. She talked about the loneliness of being famous enough to be recognized, but not famous enough to be truly protected. Phyllis Hyman was a celebrated Broadway performer who appeared in the original cast of Sophisticated Ladies, the Duke Ellington tribute musical in 1981. Her theatrical presence was so commanding that critics singled her out in a production that included major names. She had Broadway, she had jazz, she had soul. By any measure, she should have been untouchable. The industry touched her anyway. On June 30th, 1995, Phyllis Hyman took her own life in her New York City apartment. She was 45 years old. She left a note that was equal parts heartbreak and anger directed at an industry that had used her talent and left her hollow. She had a concert scheduled that same night. The Apollo Theater had to go dark. Her story is one of the least told in all of R&B history, not because it isn't important, but because it is uncomfortable. It indicts the industry too directly. It forces too many people to ask what more could have been done. The silence around Phyllis Hyman is not accidental. It is guilt wearing a quiet face. Number 2 is the entry that breaks every musician who hears it. Because this was not just addiction, this was genius colliding with illness until neither one survived. Number 2, Donny Hathaway, A Song for You.
I've been so many places.
There is a version of this story where Donny Hathaway becomes the greatest soul singer who ever lived. Not one of, the greatest. The voice, the piano, the arrangements, the emotional intelligence, all of it was there. All of it was staggering. When Donny played piano and sang simultaneously, musicians who had been performing for decades would stop what they were doing and just listen.
Places in my life and time.
That is the level we are talking about. But Donny Hathaway was also a man whose mind worked against him, and the substances he used to quiet that mind eventually made everything worse.
I've sung a lot of songs.
A Song for You was written by Leon Russell and first recorded in 1970. Donny's version from his debut album on ATO Records in 1971 is considered the definitive reading of that song by almost every serious music critic alive. It is not a technically complicated record. What makes it devastating is the honesty.
I've made some bad rides.
Donny sang like he was giving you something he could never get back. Donny was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia in the early 1970s. He was hospitalized multiple times. He was on and off medication throughout his career, and he was also using substances. The specifics were not always publicly confirmed, but people close to him have spoken about his drug use in the context of self-medication.
I've acted out my life in stages.
When your mind produces terrors that nobody else can see, you reach for whatever makes it stop. His duets with Roberta Flack, Where Is the Love, The Closer I Get to You, are among the most beloved recordings in soul music history. But even recording those songs, Donny was fighting. Even at his most beautiful, he was suffering in ways that the people around him could not fully reach.
With 10,000 people watching.
Donny Hathaway was a classically trained musician who studied at Howard University. His roommate at Howard was Roberta Flack. The two of them were discovered together, and their creative bond became one of the most documented friendships in R&B history. She has said in interviews that she never fully recovered from losing him, and you can hear it when she talks about him even now, decades later.
But we're alone now.
On January 13, 1979, Donny Hathaway fell from the 15th floor of the Essex House Hotel in New York City. He was 33 years old. The official ruling was suicide. The circumstances have been debated ever since his family has contested the ruling. And some people close to him have said his mental state in those final days was such that the line between accident and intent was impossible to draw clearly.
And I'm singing this song to you.
What is not debated is this R&B lost one of its most profound voices at 33 years old. And the music he left behind, the recordings, the live performances, the duets, contain more human truth per minute than almost anything else in the genre's catalog. To hear Donny Hathaway fully is to understand what was lost, and that understanding is a weight you carry with you. And
I know your image of me.
now, number one, the story that started before most of us were born, the story that still isn't fully told, the woman who was destroyed by addiction, by her country, and by the people who were supposed to protect her.
If this song just hit you in that quiet place, don't let this moment be a one-time thing. Subscribe to Demo. We're building a home for real R&B and soul. The kind that heals, the kind that tells the truth. Hit subscribe and come back whenever you need a song that understands you.
Every story you see here takes hours of digging, piecing together history, and bringing forgotten moments back to life. If you'd like to support that work, you can become a channel member. It's just the cost of a cup of coffee, but it helps us keep these stories alive, and for that, we're grateful. Number one, Billie Holiday, Strange Fruit. You have to understand something. Before we talk about Billie Holiday, you have to understand that she existed in an America that was openly, legally, violently hostile to black people. She grew up in poverty in Baltimore. She experienced abuse as a child that would have broken most adults.
Trees, they're strange.
She came up through the jazz clubs of New York in the 1930s when a black woman performing for white audiences was expected to be grateful for the opportunity and silent about everything else. Billie was never silent, and that silence, she refused to keep it, cost her everything.
Fruit.
Strange Fruit was first performed by Billie Holiday at Cafe Society in New York City in 1939. The song, written by Abel Meeropol, a white Jewish school teacher from the Bronx, described the lynching of black men in the American South in imagery so stark and so unflinching that the room went silent every time she sang it.
Blood on the leaves.
Billie would close her eyes, the lights would go low, and by the end, people were shaking. Commodore Records released it because her own label, Columbia, refused to touch it. It became one of the most significant protest songs in American history. Time magazine called it the Song of the Century in 1999. But
And blood at the root.
the FBI, under J. Edgar Hoover, decided that Billie Holiday was dangerous, not because of her drug use, because of Strange Fruit. because a black woman who could move rooms to political anger was a threat that needed to be neutralized. Harry Anslinger, the head of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, made Billie Holiday a personal target.
Black bodies swinging in the sun.
He assigned an agent named Jimmy Fletcher to surveil her. Fletcher later admitted that he fell in love with her, but he kept the surveillance going because his career depended on it. Anslinger used her heroin addiction as a weapon. He orchestrated her arrest in 1947.
Southern breeze, strange fruit.
She was convicted and spent a year in a federal prison in West Virginia. When she came out, she had lost her New York City cabaret card, the license required to perform in clubs. For a jazz singer, that was a career death sentence. She was banned from the stages where her art lived.
Hanging from the pop.
When Billie Holiday lay dying in Metropolitan Hospital in New York City in July 1959, federal agents arrested her in her hospital bed. She was being treated for liver failure and heart disease. She weighed 78 pounds. They handcuffed her to the bed. They posted a guard outside her door.
Trees.
You know, she died on July 17th, 1959, under arrest, under guard, with less than $1,000 in her bank account and $7,500 taped to her leg from a friend who had slipped it to her. She was 44 years old. The heroin addiction is the part of Billie Holiday's story that gets told first, but the addiction did not exist in a vacuum. She began using heroin in the early 1940s in a music industry that was saturated with it, surrounded by men who used it, in a life that had given her almost no emotional safety since childhood. She was not weak.
Pastoral scene of the gallant.
She was a human being under unimaginable pressure who found something that made the pain bearable, and then discovered that the thing making the pain bearable was building a cage around her. And then her own government, the country she was born in, used that cage to silence her. The story of Billie Holiday and addiction is not a story about personal failure.
South, the boys.
It is a story about state violence, about racism with a legal framework, about what happens when the people with power decide that a black woman's voice is too dangerous to let exist freely.
Eyes and the twisted mouth.
She changed American music. She changed American protest, and America handcuffed her on her deathbed for it. That is number one, and it should make you angry.